Hello. At this point, you should have finished reading Ethics: A Very Short Introduction, Chapter 1. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the first category of problems that we face in formulating an ethical theory. And these have to do with the origin or nature of morality. There are 5 problems we're going to focus on here. And they are called, when they're represented in the book, I call them by the same title, and I've added some additional information throughout. The death of God, relativism, evolutionary theory, false consciousness, and moral motivation. Let's look at each of these in order and see if we can get a fuller idea of how these challenges work. Probably the best explained in the text is the challenge of the death of God. This is something of a phrase that got thrown around in philosophy for a while, particularly by Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said God is dead. This is not meant to imply that God is dead, right? An infinite, eternal being has been killed or anything like that. What Nietzsche means by God is dead is that in the modern world, faced with the ambiguities that we encounter everywhere, the differences of opinions, and the known challenges to formulating a theology, we can't rely upon theism to fix our values or morals. That is, it's not enough just to say that, for instance, murder is wrong because the Bible said so. Now, there are a couple of reasons this is the case. Now, the first one, and this is one your book talks about rather thoroughly, is that there are some very counterintuitive moral principles contained in most, if not all, holy texts. Now, this is a challenge if and only if you agree that our intuition should trump here. You could imagine someone who is absolutely true to the book, who says, I believe this is wrong, or it seems wrong to me, rather. Right? It seems wrong to me, but that seeming is a mistake. The book gets it right. Well, one thing we can say about this is that psychologically speaking, we know this is relatively rare. Even theists tend to make a distinction between things that are wrong for theistic reasons and things that are wrong generally. One example is they've done some studies with Orthodox Jews, and they asked you, is it wrong to work on the Sabbath, which is a day in which you are biblically, or Talmudically, I suppose, required to rest, right? And so they say, well, yes, it's wrong to work on the Sabbath. Well, why? Because God said so. Is it wrong to murder? Yes. Why? Because God said so. All right, imagine that God didn't exist. Now, we don't have to pretend this is the actual world, right? So you might still believe in God, but imagine you existed in a world where God did not. Would it be wrong to work on the Sabbath? Probably not. Would it be wrong to murder? Probably yes. And in fact, this tended to be how the data came out. Most people would say, even those who believe that morality as it is rooted in the existence of God, would say that if God did not exist, there would still be some moral principles. This is a little bit tricky. Right? This seems to imply that there are in fact some moral standards beyond the will of the divine. This is integrally connected to what's called the Euthyphro dilemma, something introduced in your text. The way it goes is either what is good because God has determined it to be so, or gods, or whatever divine entity one worships. On the other hand, the other possibility is that the gods or God or the divine force recognizes this is good or loves it because it is good, right? So is moral law fixed by the will of the divine, or is the will of the divine in conformity with moral law? On the one hand, what you're going to have is a divine being that is prior to any morality. That is a divine being that determines what is good or evil. So imagine a Judeo-Christian God that comes in and says, this is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is good. This view was adopted by, or something like it was adopted by René Descartes, who we encountered in our last section as an epistemologist, that God could arbitrarily define these things. Now, the problem with this, the undesirable piece of this is, well, one of the words I just used there, arbitrarily. Granted, then, that God has determined moral systems, why should I care? If this is just the will of a powerful being, then that doesn't give me any really good moral motivation to act according to these rules that God is laying out. And this is going to connect to some challenges we'll see in a few minutes. On the other hand, if morality is prior to divinity, right? If there are moral laws prior to the will of any divine being, then the divinity is itself insufficient. That is, it's insufficient to generate the truth of those laws. So really, those moral principles are independent from divinity anyway, and cannot rely upon it. Right, so on one hand, right, you've got the possibility that moral principles are independent of the divine, or exist before divine will, in which case divine will has nothing to do with it, and so our morality is not rooted on theism. On the other hand, divinity is prior. God has just stipulated that these things are right and wrong, and what we lose there is the motivation to act morally, because it appears arbitrary at this point. At best, perhaps, we could make a might makes right point. That is, God is infinitely powerful, God has the power to fix these things, but that is not a moral principle we tend to be very comfortable with. Couple that with the fact that people tend to, one, interpret their religious texts in a way that excludes undesirable consequences or morally repugnant consequences, and two, that almost all theists will acknowledge that there are some things that would still be wrong even if God did not exist. And you have a pretty good argument for eliminating the idea that theism by itself is adequate to fix morality. Now, this isn't a rebuttal of theology necessarily, right? This isn't an argument against the existence of God. What this is an argument for is that you need to go beyond the mere existence of God to justify a moral worldview. And in doing so, you're going to have to engage in some more substantial philosophical work, and it ends up being quite a challenge. Let's take a look at our next challenge, though. So, one of the things that is most common in our experiences of morality is moral disagreement. And this results in the challenge of relativism. We might disagree about whether or not something is right or something is wrong. Take American political disagreements. On the one hand, we have people saying that it is wrong to allow people to, let's say, have an abortion, right? And other people saying it is wrong to prevent them from having an abortion, right? Fundamental aspect of everyday life, moral disagreement. And in fact, this is really prominent between cultures. You can look at cultures in the world, right, about whether or not, for instance, it is morally acceptable to kill someone because they've dishonored your family. Or you can look backwards or forwards in time, right, and start saying things like, well, is it morally acceptable to hold slaves, to own slaves? Well, historically speaking, many groups would have thought so. Many historical cultures were okay with that. One thing we might try to do to fix our sort of the expansion of relativism here, which is we're looking around and we're seeing all this disagreement, is that it does seem that everybody has an opinion on some things, right? Everybody has an opinion about, I don't know, death, property, that sort of thing. This seems to me a pretty weak argument, and I'm actually only mentioning it because it came up in your book. And your book acknowledges this too, is that it doesn't actually fix the problem. It might help us identify the issues upon which we are most likely to have disagreements because everyone will have some opinion about them, but we're looking for shared moral principles, and those seem to be very hard to find. Relativism then splits us between essentially two forks. On the one hand, we can be imperialists. On the other, we can be permissivists. The imperialist is going to say, look, I get that we all disagree, but you're wrong. You're all just wrong. And I'm going to do it my way. Right? And I'm going to make sure you do it in my way as well. The permissivist, on the other hand, is saying, well, all opinions are equally valid. And even though I find it morally repugnant that you have slaves in your culture, or that you are killing innocent people in your culture, I have to permit that because it's your cultural values versus mine, and neither are greater than the other, right? So there's this uncomfortable dilemma. And in fact, both ends seem problematic. At least the permissivist, we want to say, well, that's really weird. You're going to let someone murder someone because you have a disagreement about right and wrong. Well, that seems weird. Now, you can just say, I acknowledge that your views are different, and I'm still going to act upon mine. That's a somewhat more sophisticated approach to relativism, and one that we'll probably brush up against more as we move forward. Likewise, the imperialists can say, yeah, no, there just isn't objective truth. And this is going to connect to a question of objectivism versus subjectivism for moral claims, right? A claim is objective if it is a feature of the world. Right? A truth is objective. It is a feature of the world that is determined regardless of your perspective. It is subjective if your perspective changes its truth. The relativist is pushing us towards subjectivism. Now, we should distinguish here between two kinds of relativism. The kind that is most challenging right now, the one that we're addressing right now, is called descriptive relativism. It is a fact that people disagree. There is another type of relativist, which we might call a meta-ethical relativist. And these people believe that not only is it a fact that we disagree, but it's also a fact that we're all right, at least from within our own cultures. These are the ones who are going to be more permissivist. We can, however, acknowledge the descriptive fact of cultural relativism without becoming permissivist. In fact, we could be an imperialist. And this is usually what motivates imperialism. On the one, you have this idea of, well, our values and theirs differ, which means we're superior. Right, and this is something that gets brought up time and time again when you see imperial rhetoric, right? You're coming to bring the light, to bring the salvation, to bring the truth, to stop the evil. So another major challenge for us as we move forward, trying to form an ethical theory, is to say, well, if we all disagree so much, how are we going to figure out who, if anyone, is right? Let's take a look at our next challenge. So our next challenge has to do with the origin of our moral sentiments and behaviors. And this has to do with evolutionary theory. One way of dealing with morality is to say, well, look at our evolutionary history. We can tell, for instance, that groups that cooperate in certain ways are more likely to prosper than those that don't. Well, then that seems to be an evolutionary story for where morality came from. Great. However, you can develop essentially similar problems that we encountered with our theistic view with our evolutionary view. One you might encounter is what I'm going to call the evolutionary euthyphro. So either the benefit existed first, the thing that we evolved to take advantage of, right? So evolution requires that there be some sort of differential between the behaviors that you're looking at, right? To evolve in one direction, it has to increase the fitness of your population or individual, depending on your approach to evolution, but it needs to improve reproductive fitness. So either the facts that improved reproductive fitness, right, pre-existed the evolutionary process, or the other way around. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but it's actually something we can puzzle together. It's a very close analog to which came first, the chicken or the egg, and the answer is, well, they kind of evolved together over time, the chicken and the chicken egg specifically. We can also talk about things like a death of the gene, right? So as we had the death of God, just because we're evolutionarily adapted to do something doesn't justify our doing it, right? Human beings have a great many adaptive benefits. We can do things like murder each other quite efficiently. Humans are also well adapted to have multiple mates, at least males are. Humans are adapted to eat meat, but then we have moral vegetarians saying that that's not the right thing to do. Merely because we have some sort of evolutionarily adaptive behavior, and that it developed into what we now think of as morality, doesn't indicate that morality actually is right. This is another instance where we're running into this motivational problem. I'm emphasizing this because our final objection in this category is going to be specifically focusing on that motivational challenge. So evolution might present some challenges. On the one hand, there's the descriptive nature of the origin of morality, for which evolution is well suited. But if it turns out that all of our moral, quote-unquote moral behaviors, all of our ideas of normativity, descend from evolution, we might worry that the normative force behind them, the thing that makes them binding ought or should claims, is gone now, because they're merely a fact of the natural world. Our next challenge is going to do with false consciousness, and false consciousness has to do with the way that social structures can influence, inform, or warp moral intuitions. So morality, right, as we think of it, is usually, we think of it as like the good thing, right, the stuff that keeps us together. But when we look around in history, we find that morality and moral talk is often used in a way that is effective primarily at keeping people, quote-unquote, in their place. That is, morality is often used as something of a weapon against underprivileged classes of people. Now, we see in history of philosophy several people who held views like this, right? So Nietzsche believed that it was sort of the popular slave morality holding down the exceptional so that they could prosper. On the other hand, you have Marx saying that religion is the opiate of the masses. In a sense, you can generalize this to morality more typically and say, well, morality could be the opiate of the masses. Things like being respectful, being polite, right? Things like not stealing. These are laden with social values. You can only steal if something doesn't belong to you. Right. So you can only steal in a culture, one, with a notion of private property, and two, where you agree that that thing belongs to them. Imagine, for instance, in recent history, the group of people that camped out in that wildlife refuge up in Oregon. Were they stealing the land, or I guess invading the territory? Were they trespassing? Well, that's only true if you agree that the federal government owns that property. Right. So when you apply ethics, you're going to be applying a lot of social assumptions about the structure of things. Right? You're telling people to be polite. Well, that's often a way to say, for instance, be ladylike, right? To keep women in their place. The accusation of baseless anger is often a way that disadvantaged people are shut down when they try to represent themselves or present their views, right? So maybe these principles of morality, these things that we think are right and wrong, really they're actually just made to benefit the people at the top of our social order, right? Well, of course they want a system of property. They want to protect the stuff they have. Now, they might have gotten it through ways we wouldn't accept or through doing bad things, but now that they have it, they're going to say, okay, new rule, no one steals. No one takes property from one another, even though we took it from you. Right? So this is the challenge of false consciousness. That maybe what we think of as morality and what we've been taught to think of as right and wrong are tools of powerful people to control us. And this has certainly been true historically. The question is whether or not we can ever eliminate that essentially cancerous element of social power and control from our ethical theories. And if we cannot, does that undermine the value of our ethical theories entirely, or is there still something to be said for them? Our final challenge is the challenge of moral motivation. And the simplest way to put this is, why should you bother doing what is right? On the one hand, you might do it for reward. This is the child's thinking, right? You don't do bad things because you'll get yelled at, and you do good things because you get a lollipop. If we wanted to dress it up again, this is something of what the really, let's say, uncharitable atheist might say about religion. That, okay, well, if you need heaven and hell to make you act right, then there's something wrong there, right? You're just talking about rewards and punishments. But it isn't clear why we should actually do what we think is right, ever, right? So I might acknowledge that it's right to do charity work, but why would that make me actually do it? What is it about acknowledging that something is morally good that means I'm going to go do that now? Now, one way to deal with this might be that it's intrinsically motivating, right? So if we want to move beyond the idea of reward and punishment, this idea of intrinsic motivation, that merely saying a should or ought claim indicates that you are motivated to act in a certain way. Or at least assenting to the truth of a should or ought claim indicates that you are motivated to act according to that should or ought claim. But it's not clear that that's the case. There's a lot of times where saying, well, I shouldn't have that fourth piece of cheesecake, but I sure am gonna. Right? And that's a little bit problematic. So one of the things we're going to need to develop as we explore ethics more thoroughly is a way of accounting for the significance of the normativity of a state of affairs to our motivation to achieve it. That is, we need to account for why we should care and why we should bother being good people. So those are our first set of problems, and they all have to do with the nature or origin of moral principles, right? The nature or origin of the morality itself. For our next set of problems that we're going to encounter in the next video, we're going to focus on problems raised by human nature that may further eliminate or eradicate or alter, at least, our understanding of ethics. So I'll see you in that next video. I hope you understood this, and if you have any questions, let me know.